Some stories from the past are so strange, so unsettling, that they blur the line between truth and nightmare. In 1858, Georgia, one plantation master became consumed by a dangerous obsession with an enslaved person who defied every label. Someone described in hidden records as both man and woman. What began as fascination turned into madness, and what followed would unravel an entire estate, leaving behind rumors of possession, revenge, and unnatural retribution. Before we uncover this twisted piece of history, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because every story here comes from long hours of digging through real historical archives and lost testimonies buried in time. In the deep, rural heart of Georgia in 1858, the world was still chained by the institution of slavery, a system where human lives were bought, sold, and defined by their usefulness to the land and the people who owned it. The plantation at the center of this story stood out even among its neighbors. It was vast and prosperous, known for its cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Its owner, Thomas Whitlock, was a man of both wealth and pride, one who measured his worth not by his morality, but by the number of lives he controlled. Like many slaveholders of his time, Whitlock believed that order and ownership were divine rights, and he enforced both with the cold precision of someone who had long forgotten compassion. The Whitlock plantation was home to more than 100 enslaved people who worked the fields, tended the livestock, and maintained the house. To the outside world, it was a symbol of Southern prosperity. To those who lived under its control, it was a place of exhaustion, fear, and silence. But in the spring of that year, something, or rather someone, arrived who would alter everything. A newly purchased slave was brought to the estate from a nearby auction. No one knew much about them, where they were born, who their parents were, or how many hands they had already passed through. What struck everyone immediately, though, was the unsettling ambiguity of their appearance. The newcomer possessed features that blurred traditional understanding of gender. The auctioneer, unsure of how to categorize them, described the person as a field hand of unusual strength and composure, but rumors soon began to swirl. Some said the individual's body carried both the traits of a man and a woman. Others claimed they were simply shaped by hardship, their appearance distorted by years of labor and malnutrition. Whatever the truth, it became impossible for the enslaved community, and later for the master himself, to ignore the air of mystery surrounding this person. They were quiet, observant, and strangely composed. When spoken to, they responded with respect, but their gaze carried a depth that unsettled those who tried to look too long. Within the first few weeks of their arrival, the plantation began to feel different. The enslaved people whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of this new presence. Some felt drawn to them, believing they carried a spiritual gift. Others were frightened, sensing something that felt beyond human. Their ability to adapt so quickly to the grueling life of the fields only deepened the intrigue. They seemed neither to tire nor to complain, and yet there was something haunting in their silence, a weight that suggested they had seen far more suffering than anyone could imagine. When word of the newcomer reached Thomas Whitlock, his curiosity was piqued. He was not a man who usually paid personal attention to his field hands, but this one was different. Something about the way the others avoided speaking their name, The way they looked away when asked about them stirred his interest. He ordered that the enslaved person be brought to the main house, saying he wanted to assess their strength for domestic duties. But beneath that command was a fascination that he could not fully explain. The moment he saw them up close, he felt both confusion and obsession begin to take root. To the master, this person represented a puzzle he could not solve, a contradiction to his rigid beliefs about order, power, and nature itself. What he didn't realize was that his fascination would soon evolve into something far darker, setting off a chain of events that would consume not just him, but everyone connected to the plantation. What began as a simple transaction, another purchase in a life built on cruelty, was about to unravel into a story of obsession, fear, and consequences that no one could have foreseen. The arrival of that enslaved person marked the moment when the Whitlock plantation crossed from history into legend, and nothing would ever be the same again. At first, the new arrival was just another face among the many who labored beneath the Georgia sun. But that illusion of normalcy did not last long. Thomas Whitlock, the master of the plantation, began to notice the new worker more and more often. It wasn't simply their strength or endurance that caught his attention. It was something harder to name. The way they carried themselves, with quiet confidence and a strange grace, was unlike anyone he had ever owned. In the world where enslaved people were expected to bow, to hide, to diminish themselves, this person did none of that. They obeyed, yes, but without fear. They moved through the world as if some unseen power protected them, and that unsettled Whitlock deeply. He began to ask questions about them, where they came from, what their name was, whether they spoke much. The overseers could tell him little. All they knew was that the person had been purchased from an auction in Savannah, sold off a smaller plantation after rumors spread that strange things happened wherever they were kept. Livestock had died without reason. Children had taken ill. Masters had quarreled with their wives until tragedy struck. Most dismissed it as superstition, the kind of talk that followed misery in the slave trade. But Whitlock couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this one. It started innocently enough, curiosity cloaked as interest. He would pause to watch as they worked in the fields, the sunlight reflecting off their skin, their movements steady and unbroken. Their bodies seemed to defy easy categorization. Broad-shouldered, but with delicate features, a voice soft yet commanding when they spoke. Whitlock found himself staring longer than he should, trying to understand what it was that disturbed him. The more he observed, the more his fascination grew, until curiosity began to twist into obsession. Among the enslaved community, whispers began to spread. They noticed the master's attention, the way his eyes followed the new arrival when he thought no one was looking. The older women warned that no good ever came from a master's fascination, that such interest always led to pain. The person at the center of it all seemed to sense what was coming. They kept their distance, working quietly, speaking only when spoken to. But there was no avoiding Whitlock's gaze for long. One afternoon, he summoned them to the house. The excuse was simple enough. He claimed he wanted to assign them to domestic duties, away from the harshness of the fields. When they arrived, the air inside the main house felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Whitlock dismissed the servants and asked them to stand before him. He studied them in silence, the sound of the ticking clock echoing through the room. For the first time, he realized how uneasy they made him feel, not because of fear, but because they disrupted the order of his world. Everything about them seemed to challenge his understanding of power, gender, and control. They were both, and yet neither, and he could not comprehend it. What began as fascination soon turned into fixation. Whitlock found reasons to keep them close, bringing them to the house for chores that could easily have been done by others, asking questions that went beyond duty, searching for answers he could never articulate. The more he tried to understand them, the more he felt drawn in by the mystery. He began to dream of them, dreams that blurred the line between desire and dread. When he woke, he felt ashamed, but the shame only deepened the hunger to see them again. The other enslaved workers noticed the shift. The master grew more volatile, his mood swinging from charm to cruelty, his behavior erratic. The overseers whispered that the new arrival had bewitched him, that no man could look upon them too long without losing his peace. The master's wife, too, began to notice his distraction, his long absences, his restless nights. A quiet tension began to build within the house, thick and poisonous. Whitlock's fascination was no longer about curiosity. It was control, desire and fear, all tangled together. He wanted to own not just their body, but whatever force seemed to live within them. Yet the more he tried to dominate, the more his authority seemed to slip away. His obsession had begun to consume him, and though he did not yet realize it, this attraction would soon become the undoing of his home, his family, and his soul. The slave who was both man and woman had become the mirror of his corruption, and what stared back at him would be far darker than anything he could have imagined. It began subtly, almost too faintly to notice at first. A misplaced tool here, a lamp flickering out though the oil was fresh, a chill that ran through rooms even on humid Georgia nights. The slaves whispered among themselves that the spirits were stirring, that the house had grown uneasy since the arrival of the one who was both man and woman. But whispers were common on plantations. Superstition was often the only way to make sense of an unkind world. Still, as days passed, those quiet omens began to twist into something far more sinister. The first undeniable incident happened one evening when the master's wife, Eleanor Whitlock, claimed she awoke to see a shadow standing by her bed. She said it was shaped like a person, but not quite, a figure neither man nor woman, staring at her in silence. When she screamed, the figure vanished. Her husband brushed it off as hysteria, but the house staff swore they saw footprints outside her window the next morning, though no one had entered or left. From that day forward, Eleanor's health began to fade. She lost her appetite, her voice trembled, and her mind seemed consumed by something unseen. Down in the slave quarters, stories began spreading faster. People said the new arrival could walk without sound, could be seen in 2 places at once. A child claimed to have seen them speaking softly to the wind, and moments later a storm rolled in from nowhere. One night, when a worker insulted them behind their back, that same man fell ill before dawn, his skin hot to the touch, his breath rattling in his chest. He recovered days later, but his voice never did. After that, no one dared to speak ill of the new one again. Inside the main house, strange noises became common. Drawers opened on their own, dishes fell from shelves, though no one was near them, and the dogs that once patrolled the property began refusing to go near the servant quarters. Whitlock himself felt the unease creeping into his bones, though he refused to admit it. He'd wake at night drenched in sweat, certain he'd heard footsteps outside his door. Sometimes he dreamed of the enslaved person standing beside his bed, their eyes dark and endless, whispering things he couldn't remember upon waking. Still, he could not stay away. Each day he called for them more often, asking meaningless questions, finding reasons to keep them close. And each time he felt that strange, heavy air around them. It was not fear exactly, it was something deeper, an awareness that he stood before something he couldn't control. The enslaved person rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when they did, their words carried a quiet authority that made even Whitlock falter. The other slaves began performing quiet rituals to ward off whatever had been awakened. They left salt at their doors, tied bits of cloth around the trees, and whispered old prayers under their breath at night. But the disturbances only worsened. Fires burned too quickly, crops wilted without reason, and the birds that once filled the mornings with song vanished from the fields. The plantation, once a place of cruel order, had fallen under a strange and invisible disorder. One afternoon, as Whitlock stood outside his study, he overheard two of his overseers whispering about how the hermaphrodite slave was bringing ruin to the land. They spoke of curses, of God's punishment, of things unnatural to man. Whitlock dismissed them angrily, yet the words struck deep. That night he dreamt of the enslaved person again, only this time they were standing over his bed holding a burning brand. When he woke, he found the curtains of his room smoldering. By now, even the bravest workers moved with fear in their eyes. The enslaved person was rarely seen during daylight, often sent to tasks alone, yet the sense of their presence lingered everywhere. The master's wife refused to stay in the same house and moved into the guest quarters, muttering prayers. Whitlock's obsession had become a sickness, and his household was unraveling one small horror at a time. The strange events were no longer whispered about. They ruled the plantation. The air grew thick, heavy with dread. It was as if the land itself was rejecting its owner, rebelling against the cruelty and corruption that had festered there for generations. Some said the enslaved person was a vessel for divine justice. Others claimed they were something far darker, born not of heaven or hell, but of the in-between. Whatever the truth was, it had already taken root in the hearts of everyone on that land, and the line between the living and the cursed had begun to fade. Eleanor Whitlock had once been the quiet strength of the plantation, a woman raised in privilege, trained to smile through silence and to bear her husband's moods without question. But by the summer of 1858, something inside her began to fracture. The house that had once obeyed her now seemed alive with shadows. Servants avoided her gaze. Her husband, Thomas, barely spoke to her anymore, his attention fixed on the enslaved person who had become the center of every whisper, every glance, every unease that haunted the household. Eleanor could feel it, the pull between them, dark and forbidden, a gravity she could not compete with. What began as jealousy turned to something colder, hatred mixed with terror. She watched the changes in Thomas first, the way he would call the enslaved person to his study late into the night, the long pauses behind closed doors, the tremble in his hands when they spoke to him. She saw how he would stare after them, his face pale with confusion, as though the world itself had shifted beneath him. To Eleanor it was humiliation of the cruelest kind. Her husband, a man of refined breeding, obsessed with someone he owned, someone whose very existence he had once called unnatural. The whispers among the house servants only deepened her fury. They said the person was both man and woman, touched by something divine or cursed, and that Thomas had fallen under their spell. Eleanor's jealousy festered until it became an illness. She stopped eating. Her eyes sunk deep, her voice sharpened like glass. At first, she confronted her husband, demanding to know why he would bring that creature into her home. Thomas struck her. That moment, that single blow, sealed her resolve. If her husband would not rid their home of this abomination, then she would. Late one night, she sent for 2 of the field hands she trusted, promising them freedom if they obeyed her. She ordered them to take the enslaved person into the woods and teach them fear. Her voice trembled with rage as she spoke, but beneath it was desperation, a belief that by purging this person from her world, she could restore her sanity, her marriage, her sense of power. The men obeyed, though with dread in their hearts. When they led the enslaved person away, they said nothing. They bound their hands, led them past the fields, and into the swamp where the cypress trees loomed like ancient ghosts. But what happened there remains shrouded in mystery. The men returned before dawn, their faces white as bone. They spoke of screams that weren't human, of wind that howled though no storm had risen. One of them claimed he saw eyes watching them from the water, not animal eyes, but human, dozens of them, flickering beneath the surface. They swore they left the enslaved person there, tied and beaten. Yet when Eleanor demanded proof, none could speak of a body. The next morning, the same enslaved person was seen back at the plantation, working silently, with not a mark upon their skin. That broke Eleanor's last thread of reason. She became convinced that she was cursed, that her home had become the dwelling place of something beyond this world. Her behavior grew erratic. She wandered the halls at night, clutching a Bible, muttering prayers that dissolved into sobs. She accused the servants of conspiring against her, of harboring demons. Even Thomas began to fear her. He forbade her from speaking of the incident again, insisting that she had imagined everything. But Eleanor knew what she had seen, and worse, she knew what she had done. Soon after, her health began to fail completely. Her skin turned pale, her hands trembled, and her mind slipped into delirium. She would wake screaming that the enslaved person stood at her bedside, smiling with eyes like molten gold. Once a maid found her scratching her arms until they bled, saying she could feel hands under her skin. The plantation's doctor declared it madness brought on by stress. But those who worked the land knew better. They said she was paying the price for her cruelty, that the spirit she had tried to destroy was now consuming her from within. By the time autumn came, Eleanor Whitlock was a ghost of herself. She no longer left her room. The master's obsession had destroyed his wife just as surely as it had unmade him. The house itself felt darker, quieter, as if waiting for something inevitable. And deep within its walls, the enslaved person continued their silent work, untouched, unreadable, as though nothing in the world, not jealousy, not violence, not even death, could reach them. Eleanor's cruelty had only fed whatever power lingered there. The balance of fear had shifted, and the plantation no longer belonged to the Whitlocks. It belonged to something far older, far stronger, and far less forgiving. The first to fall ill was one of the overseers, a hard man named Barrett, who had once bragged that no spirit, no curse, no slave trickery could ever touch him. One morning he collapsed in the fields, trembling and muttering nonsense. By sundown, his body had twisted in pain, his eyes wide open even in death. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream. The doctor called it fever. The slaves whispered otherwise. They said it was judgment. They said Barrett had been seen beating the enslaved person, who was both man and woman, only a week before. After Barrett's death, things began to unravel faster than anyone could explain. The horses refused to eat. Milk curdled the moment it was brought into the house. The well water, once clear, turned cloudy overnight, and no one who drank from it kept their strength for long. The Whitlock plantation, once lush and prosperous, began to decay from within. The cotton wilted before harvest. The air smelled of rot. The workers grew pale and tired, plagued by dreams they could not shake, dreams of eyes watching them from the dark, of a voice whispering their names just before dawn. Inside the main house, the sickness took a different form. Thomas Whitlock, once proud and commanding, now looked hollow, as though something was eating him from the inside. He'd sit in his study for hours, staring at the fire, muttering the same questions over and over. "What are you? Why won't you leave me?" Servants claimed to hear him speaking to someone when no one else was there. At times, they'd find the enslaved person standing outside his window, still as stone, their gaze locked on him through the glass. When confronted, they'd say nothing, only turn away slowly and vanish into the fields. Eleanor Whitlock's illness worsened too. She would wake screaming in the night, clutching her chest, claiming she felt something crawling beneath her skin. Her screams echoed through the halls until even the servants refused to stay near her room after dark. The doctor began visiting daily, but nothing he did helped. Her body weakened, as if something invisible drained her life away. On the third week of her decline, she told her maid in a whisper that the enslaved person came to her in her dreams, neither man nor woman, but both, their face split by a knowing smile. "They said," she gasped, "that I took what was theirs. Now they've come to take it back." And then came the deaths. First, one of the kitchen girls, found lying face down by the hearth, with her eyes open and her lips burned black. Then a field worker who vanished during the night, his footprints leading toward the swamp, but never back. Each loss deepened the terror until no one spoke above a whisper. The slaves began lighting fires around their quarters at night, murmuring old protective chants from the lands of their ancestors. Even those who didn't believe in curses started to feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on them. Thomas Whitlock grew paranoid. He began accusing his workers of witchcraft, of plotting against him. He carried a pistol everywhere, his hands shaking so badly he could barely aim it. Once, he caught sight of the enslaved person standing in the courtyard, staring at him. Thomas shouted for them to leave, but they didn't move. He fired. The shot echoed across the fields. When the smoke cleared, the enslaved person was gone. But in their place, on the dirt where they'd stood, was a mark. An ashen print in the shape of a hand, half the size of his own. The plantation was now consumed by fear. Servants refused to enter the house after sundown. The slaves spoke of the dead walking in the night, of voices whispering through the walls. Even the trees around the property seemed to wither, their leaves blackening under a sky that never seemed bright anymore. It was as though the land itself had turned against its master. By the winter of 1858, half the plantation's workers were gone, dead, missing, or fled. The Whitlocks were left with silence and decay. Visitors from nearby estates came once and never returned, whispering that the Whitlock grounds were cursed, that something unholy walked the halls. Those who lived nearby claimed they saw lights moving through the fields at night, and faint, mournful singing drifting through the fog. Whatever had been awakened on that land refused to rest. The illnesses, the deaths, the whispers, they weren't random. They were retribution. The master's obsession had torn open something ancient and merciless, something that didn't care about class, color, or name. The enslaved person, both man and woman, had become more than human in their suffering. They were the storm that swallowed everything around them. And by the time the last of the Whitlocks realized what they had unleashed, it was already far too late. The night the enslaved person vanished was unlike any other. A storm rolled across Georgia with a rage that seemed personal, lightning splitting the sky open, thunder rattling the windows of the Whitlock mansion like the roar of something ancient. Rain fell so heavily it drowned out every other sound, and by morning the world outside looked washed clean and unfamiliar. But one thing was certain. The enslaved person who had haunted the master's every waking thought was gone. No one saw them leave, no one heard a sound, and yet their sleeping cot was empty, their few possessions gone. It was as if they had dissolved into the storm itself. Thomas Whitlock went mad, searching for them. He ordered the remaining overseers to scour the woods, the swamps, even the riverbanks. He rode through the rain for days, shouting their name into the wind, as if the trees themselves could answer him. He returned each night soaked, trembling, eyes wild. He refused to eat, refused to sleep. "They belong to me," he kept saying. "No one takes what's mine." But the more he searched, the clearer it became that the enslaved person hadn't escaped in the way others did. Their absence didn't feel like freedom. It felt like presence, like they were still there, watching. And then the signs began. On the third morning after the disappearance, the cook found something outside the back door, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, she screamed and dropped it to the ground. Inside were 5 small bones, tied together with hair. The hair was unmistakable. It was the same golden color as Eleanor Whitlock's. That same day, the master's wife woke with claw marks down her arms, though her door had been locked from the inside. She said she'd seen a shadow standing at the foot of her bed, neither man nor woman but both, smiling like they knew something I didn't. The following nights grew worse. The servants reported seeing the enslaved person in reflections, in mirrors, in windows, in water. Their figure would appear for an instant and then vanish. One of the field hands swore he saw them walking across the flooded fields barefoot, the rain soaking through their clothes, yet their steps left no prints in the mud. Another said he heard their voice calling his name from the woods, soft and calm, almost loving, until he turned to look and saw no one. Inside the mansion, the air thickened with dread. The master began to hear footsteps outside his study, slow and deliberate, long after the others had gone to sleep. And when he turned, he saw wet footprints leading to his door. One large, one smaller, overlapping as though two people had walked the same path in one body. When he followed the trail, it stopped abruptly at the hearth, where the fire hissed and went out on its own. The staff tried to leave, but every time someone fled, a new misfortune struck. One man drowned in the swamp. Another vanished on the road to Savannah. His cart found days later, with the horse dead in its traces. It was as though the plantation itself had become a trap, holding all who remained in the grasp of whatever presence lingered. The enslaved people began to speak of the missing one not as human, but as spirit, a being caught between life and death, man and woman, servant and God. They said the storm hadn't taken them, it had revealed them. One night Thomas Whitlock swore he saw them standing in his parlor. The candles dimmed, and there they were, dressed in white, their face calm but their eyes endless. He fell to his knees, begging forgiveness, begging to be free of whatever curse bound him. But the figure said nothing. They simply raised a hand, and the flames of every candle in the room went out. When the servants found Whitlock at dawn, he was alive but broken, muttering a single phrase over and over. They came back whole. By the end of that week, both Thomas and Eleanor were gone. Some said they fled. Others swore they died and were buried secretly to keep the curse contained. But the enslaved people knew better. They whispered that the spirit of the one who was both man and woman had taken them, body and soul, to the place where justice meets the grave. Even after the house stood abandoned, travelers reported strange sights, light flickering in the windows, soft footsteps echoing through the halls, and a voice singing an old hymn in the night. And in the ruins of the Whitlock plantation, where vines now swallow brick and memory alike, people still claim to see a figure standing in the rain, neither man nor woman, but both, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to disturb what was never meant to be owned. By the winter of 1859, the Whitlock plantation no longer resembled the proud estate it once had been. The cotton fields lay barren, the air hung heavy with mildew and decay, and the once grand house stood like a hollow carcass against the grey sky. Windows shattered by storms had never been replaced, doors swung loosely on rusted hinges, and ivy crept up the brick walls like veins reclaiming flesh. No laughter, no music, no labouring voices filled the grounds anymore. Only silence, broken by the occasional groan of the old wooden beams that seemed to breathe with the weight of memory. The community nearby whispered that the land itself had gone mad. Some said they could hear screams carried on the wind at night. Others swore they'd seen lantern lights flickering across the property, even though no one had lived there for months. The truth was that the Whitlocks were gone, vanished, consumed, or simply erased, and all that remained was the stain of what they had done. But the enslaved people who had once been trapped there, those who survived, told a different story. They said the plantation hadn't just fallen, it had been claimed. In the weeks following the disappearance of Thomas and Eleanor Whitlock, everything began to unravel with terrifying precision. The overseers who remained fled, their horses found wandering the fields days later, their saddles empty. The house servants, left with no master to serve, gathered what little they could and walked away under cover of night. Yet even as they left, they swore they felt eyes on them, soft, patient, forgiving, and damning all at once. The enslaved person who had been both man and woman was gone, yet their presence lingered everywhere, in the whisper of the trees, in the low hum of the wind, in the strange warmth that surrounded the few who had shown kindness to them. By spring, nature began to consume what remained. The well collapsed in on itself. The crops grew wild and tangled. The paths once worn smooth by footsteps disappeared beneath moss. The land seemed to breathe again, but not in peace. It was as though it remembered. Some said that at night the swamp behind the plantation glowed faintly, and if you stood near it long enough, you could hear a voice humming, deep, sorrowful, and powerful. The elders said it was not a haunting, it was a warning. Travelers who dared to cross the property spoke of seeing figures moving through the mist, shadows that looked human until you looked too closely. Then their forms would shift, blurring the lines between male and female, slave and master, life and death. Those who saw them described an overwhelming feeling of guilt, as if the land itself forced them to remember something they had never lived but had always been complicit in. One preacher passing through the area declared that the Whitlock estate had been struck by the hand of divine balance. But others, especially those who still carried the memory of bondage, said it wasn't divine, it was justice, pure and unrelenting. Over time, the story of the Whitlock plantation became a legend. Parents warned their children not to wander near the old grounds. Hunters avoided the swamps where the enslaved person had once vanished. Some of the freedmen who settled nearby built small shrines along the property's edge, stones stacked in quiet reverence, bits of cloth tied to branches, as offerings to the spirit that had brought freedom through fear. They didn't fear the ghost that lingered. They honored it, because in their hearts they knew that the spirit had destroyed the Whitlocks, not out of vengeance, but out of balance. The world moved on, but the legend endured. Long after the Civil War ended, when the fields of Georgia were carved into new farms and the names of old masters faded from records, people still whispered about that cursed land. Travelers claimed that during heavy rain, when thunder rolled low and slow, you could see a figure walking along the edge of the old fields, tall, silent, and radiant in the lightning's flash. Neither man nor woman, yet both, their eyes reflecting the storm, their face calm as though they carried no anger, only truth, and sometimes, they said, the air would grow still, the rain would quiet, and a voice would rise from the distance, singing in a language older than slavery, older than the soil itself. Those who heard it would fall silent, because they understood. The song wasn't of vengeance, but of remembrance, a reminder that what was done in cruelty can never truly be buried. The collapse of the Whitlock plantation wasn't a tragedy. It was a reckoning. The master's obsession, the wife's cruelty, the suffering of the enslaved, all had been weighed, and judgment had come in a form no man could control. The enslaved person, who was both man and woman, had become something eternal, a guardian, a ghost, a storm, and a symbol of the balance that even death could not break. The land bore their story like a scar, and through every whispering wind and every trembling leaf, it seemed to speak one unending truth. Some spirits do not die. They become the truth their oppressors feared most. Even decades after the Whitlock plantation crumbled into ruin, its story refused to die. Locals claimed that the land itself breathed with memory, that even the soil could recall the blood, tears, and madness that had soaked it. Travelers heading through Georgia would sometimes stop by the overgrown property just to glimpse what they called the land of two spirits. Some left terrified, others moved to silence. All left changed, because there was something undeniably alive about that place, something watching, something waiting. When the war ended and the years turned, time swallowed most plantations whole. Fields became forests again, mansions became bones for ivy and moss. But not the Whitlock place. Even when nature tried to reclaim it, something held it apart from peace. Locals said it was because of the spirit, the one who had once been both man and woman, slave and savior, the one who broke the cycle of ownership not by running, but by ending it. They said that when the storms came, you could see their outline moving through the lightning, tall and silent. A shape caught between worlds. It became a story parents told their children on nights when thunder rolled through the hills. Don't go near the old Whitlock land, for it's still watched by the one who was both. Some said the spirit was a curse, punishing any soul who stepped upon those cursed grounds. Others said it was a guardian, keeping cruel men away, protecting those who meant no harm. The line between ghost and god blurred until no one could say what the figure truly was. There were countless accounts, each stranger than the last. A hunter once claimed he saw the figure walking through the swamp, lantern in hand, the light shining not from flame, but from within the figure itself. When he called out, the figure turned, and he saw a face that was both young and ancient, neither male nor female, but something in between. Balanced, calm, powerful. The hunter fell to his knees, unable to speak. When he looked up again, the figure was gone, but the lantern's glow still hovered in the mist, pulsing like a heartbeat. Years later, when the land was purchased by a northern investor trying to rebuild after the war, his workers refused to stay. They said tools disappeared overnight, animals panicked for no reason, and voices whispered from the fields. The new owner dismissed it all, until the night he heard singing outside his window. A deep, sorrowful hymn carried by a voice both masculine and soft, rising and falling like a tide. When he looked out, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the property, hands raised toward the house. The song grew louder, and with it came the scent of rain. By dawn, the house was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. The owner left Georgia the next day and never returned. As time passed, the legend grew into folklore. The enslaved person who was both man and woman became a symbol, whispered in sermons and songs, a spirit of justice, a guardian of balance. Among the freedmen, the story took on sacred meaning. They said the spirit remained to remind the living that freedom gained through blood must never be forgotten. They called them the Twin Soul, and built small stone altars near the river where the Whitlock lands once stood. Offerings of corn, flowers, and river water were left for the spirit, not in fear, but in gratitude. But not everyone came to honor. In the early 1900s, when a group of men attempted to build a road through the area, their tools broke before the work even began. They laughed at the stories, but on the second day a worker fell dead, no wound, no illness, just gone. The others swore they heard a whisper in the wind that night. This land remembers. The road was never built, even now. Generations later, travelers passing through rural Georgia speak of that stretch of land. They say when the storms come, the lightning doesn't strike the ground. It dances, curling and twisting through the clouds like something alive. And sometimes, if the rain falls hard enough, A voice rises beneath it, a soft, mournful hum, neither high nor low. Like two voices singing as one, the legend of the Whitlock Plantation endures not because of fear, but because of what it represents. It is the story of a person who defied every chain, physical, spiritual, and human, and became something eternal. The haunting is not one of vengeance, but of remembrance. A reminder that power built on cruelty will always crumble, and that those once silenced can become the loudest echoes of history. And so the spirit remains, walking the misty edges of the Georgia swamp, watching, waiting, and reminding anyone who dares to listen that truth never dies. It only changes form. The enslaved person who was both man and woman lives on in legend, not as a victim, but as a force, bound by neither gender nor flesh, but by justice, memory, and the unending demand that the world never forget what was done in darkness.